At a bare minimum, everything should exist to just be that clear window for God and his message and his power to shine through.
Welcome to AWI's podcast. This is just a time for real and authentic conversations surrounding Christian worship, discussing questions and topics about theology, artistry, and leadership. I'm Taylor Cummings, and this is Jonathan Lord, or J. Lord. And how did that name actually come about?
Sure. So I am an APU alum twice over. My freshman year, I was in men's chorale, as very many people were during my time. And there was just this dude in men's chorale who one day was like, hey, your first name's Jonathan, your last name's Lord. I'm just going to start calling you J. Lord. And so I just will forevermore be known as J. Lord, apparently.
That's cool. That's really awesome. Yeah. Dang. Before we get into more of the specific technology aspects, let's take like a step back and how would you define worship?
Yeah, man, what a question. Worship is really anything done to the intention of glorifying God. We're all familiar with how all the connotations behind worship and the arts and music aspect of it.
Yeah.
But the person leading worship is not leading worship on stage is not worshiping any more than the person putting cones out in the parking lot.
Yeah.
And it's in that way a mindset, right? Like anything can be worship as long as you do it as unto God and not unto man.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's beautiful. Yeah. With that definition, how does technology fit into that?
Yeah. So again, technology can be a very broad term. The nature of what we're talking about and what we do is very weekend service centric. But even backing out of that for a little bit, like pager systems for parents, right? Like I've seen really great integrations where your child's number appears on screen in the middle of the sermon in a subtle way so that a parent knows their child needs them, right? Like that's a very subtle integration of technology. We might not even consider that like worship technology, but that's a form of hospitality towards that parent and taking care of this child and this life that God has entrusted to you. So, whether we're talking about fog machines and lasers, or like digital signage that shows people where to go on your church campus, or even like outreach opportunities out in the community, and in integrating there, like again, any technology that can facilitate these actions done for the glory of God could play a role. Yeah. Because
worship is so much of the drawing closer to the Lord, and in roles that help facilitate or lead that, it's all about that facilitation of like what can make it easier for people to enter in, to connect with each other, to connect with God. And technology is such an avenue of that. I have two questions. When thinking of it church specific, what all does technology and worship entail there? And then after that, like outside of the specific Sunday service, what does that look like?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so much, right?
Yeah.
Weekend specific, there's so much focus on what happens, in the sanctuary, in the actual house of worship.
Yeah.
Lights, audio, video, graphics, live streaming, all of your traditional things that we think of that are contributing to this shared weekend experience. And then, like we were saying, there are so many things that go beyond that. I think of like our children's ministry at my church where, we have like really specialized label printers that kind of going back to kids ministry.
Yeah.
Like every kid gets a little sticker on their back that says like their number and pairs them with their parent, which gets, it's that element of security and hospitality and taking care of these kids. I think about, live streaming and all of, the online resources that we have. Our church recently just started a podcast.
Nice.
That is like specifically in response to the sermon. So as soon as like the sermon and even during the sermon, people are texting in questions. that they then record midweek and get turned around really quickly. So
The church does the same thing.
yeah, well, and it's so
Yeah.
great because that's really, I think, technology's greatest power is scale. A thing that, you maybe used to be a one-on-one conversation with one person can now be recorded and distributed to the whole church.
And everyone can be a part of that conversation.
Exactly. Like
Yeah, that's huge.
your ability to digitally shepherd an entire congregation with practically no more effort than it did to shepherd a single person in a single conversation.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And so then outside of the church, how can that be worship as well?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is community engagement and service projects. Social media is really great for, delivering things to people, whether that is midweek encouragement videos. Again, getting into that podcast, this idea of like follow up on stuff that's happening on Sundays, but during the midweek as well. What else? It's kind of endless. At that point, I would almost turn to the community more than the technology. Like, what does the community need, right? Are we using technology to coordinate a day where we can all, clean up an empty lot or something? I mean, it's very stereotypical, kind of silly examples, but at that point, it's about finding needs and integrating into your community. Those are honest, like social media is a great way to plug into your community and find out those needs.
Right.
How many cities have like a random little Facebook group where people can like reach out for stuff. Like we can be in those groups as community service providers, finding needs and filling them, in the name of Jesus.
Yeah. It's cool that technology allows you to reach outside of just like the moments when we're specifically together, but to connect outside of the like four walls of the church, but also like outside of the Sunday service, outside of the prayer night, like outside of the specific gatherings, which are so special. And yet it allows those gatherings to reach more than who's specifically there. But then it also allows, how do we connect midweek? How do we like make worship not just a Sunday thing? Because worship is an everyday thing. And it's cool that technology allows for that advancement and expansion. As you've seen throughout your life, technology grow, have you seen it, the tension of being used for more glorification of God or more glorification of people?
I guess it depends on your scale.
Totally. And it's open-ended.
Yeah, I mean, every tool has potential for good and potential for evil, right? I mean, just the internet, right? There are an infinite amount of things there that go in every which way and direction, and that can be just an example and an analogy for every piece of technology.
Yeah.
As Christians, we believe that humans are inherently flawed and selfish, and it is by God's grace that we can overcome that and achieve anything good.
Yeah, true.
And it's the same thing with technology. It is anything that we use can be used for selfish or for selfless means.
True.
It's almost hard to say.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, God is so good that even if someone's maybe posture isn't even in the fully correct way, God can still use it for good.
Yeah.
Through what they say, through who they reach, and that's what's cool about it. But yeah, do you ever get pushback with the use of technology? Because technology can enhance a worship experience or a church service. Just like we talked about how it advances and expands and everything, so it can enhance a lot. But do you ever get pushback of people saying technology makes it feel more like a show or a performance? How do you go about that?
Totally. There's very good reason for that to be said a lot of times, even when it's done properly.
Yeah.
So the goal of, I'll zoom this out and say production, and I'll include, the actual music and the people producing the music there. I like to think of it as a stained glass window versus a non-stained glass, just like a normal window. Really, the goal of any weekend service should be to be a clear window, right?
That's
to
a
let
cool image,
to let God's glory and power
Directly
shine through,
in,
and not to diss on stained glass windows or anything.
They're beautiful.
Yeah, we have a couple
But they
behind us
do
right
make
now.
your view blurry. Like I can't see directly outside. I
Yeah.
can kind of see a plant, but it's blurry.
Yeah, well, and you're focused on the window. It's a very pretty window,
True.
right?
Yes.
And so our goal, I think, really, regardless of context, should be to be as clear and clean of a window as possible. It should be to be not noticed, to be distraction free.
Yeah.
And there are so many things that can cause distractions. This is why musical excellence is so important.
True.
If you're stumbling over notes or words, or you're playing out of time with each other, that's dirt on your window.
Yeah.
Right? It pulls you out of the moment. All of a sudden, you're not focusing on the words. Yeah, exactly. You can't focus on God. And I would apply those exact same principles to technology. If the vocals are too far down and the drums are too loud, we can't hear anything.
Correct.
If the vocals are piercing your ears, like you're in literal
You're
physical
like,
pain, yeah, and so you can't focus on anything. So at a bare minimum, everything should exist to just be that clear window for God and his message and his power to shine through.
Yeah.
And I think there is... So again, coming back to this, so there is an element of performance to that, because performance involves practicing everything so well.
Excellence.
Yeah. So like it seems effortless,
Right.
and you can just do that, without anyone worrying about whether or not you're going to make it through that third verse or something.
Right. Or if you hit the wrong note, and it's like practicing enough to where it's like, okay, like I know the lyrics, I know the notes, so therefore I can actually worship in the moment as well.
Yeah, and so there's this huge, almost direct overlap with worship and performance in that sense. And so it's the same thing with technology. It's like we, using sound as an example, we want our mixes to sound really good and really well produced, so that they aren't creating any kind of distraction. They should be smooth and balanced, and you should be able to hear everything sufficiently. So where that can get excessive is when all of a sudden, we are no longer being a clear window, but we're adding little bits of color, and all of a sudden it's not just like, oh, everything's well lit so I can see the stage, but it's like, oh, wow, like, man, check out those, lasers and fog machines. And
or it's like, oh, it's
like
shining in my eye, like I can't see this words on the screen now.
Yeah, exactly.
Or
Maybe overproduced music where it's like, oh, man, listen to all of these, like, 40 tracks they have, or and I'm guilty of this as a guitar player.
Yeah.
Man, that guitar solo was ripping instead of like
there's not even a guitar player on stage.
Right. Yeah.
But also you need a guitar. Yeah.
Right. So once it becomes distracting, once it takes away from the focus on God instead of contributing to the focus on God, is I think where that line is. And again, so many people and so many faith traditions have different tolerances for that.
True.
If you grew up in a more charismatic church, man, you probably don't even notice the fog machines and lasers anymore because that's what you grew up with. Whereas if you maybe grew up in a more conservative or maybe a really liturgical,
it's very simple.
Yeah, and like a drum set might freak you out, and that's fair. Like that's your experience, and that's what your congregation needs to help focus them on God. So it's really subjective, and in some ways is really hard to make specific calls on.
Yeah. How would you even define technology? Because technically, drums is like a form of technology. Like microphone, this is a form of technology. Like there's kind of an endless form of technology. Like how would you even define that word?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, like you're saying, drums are technology. To my grandparents, like a toaster was technology.
Totally.
Yeah, and our tolerance for what we consider technology just keeps going up and up.
As advancements are, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think you could probably get technical and say like things that require electricity or something like that.
Right.
But again, like it's such a moving target. It is, one day iPhones are the brand new thing, and now it's everyone has a smartphone. Like smartphones almost aren't technology anymore.
It's just a regular thing that we think everyone has now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, that's something we need to continue to be sensitive to as we are in multi-generational congregations, is people have different definitions and different levels of comfort with technology.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, like it's one of those things that's like, it's almost too broad to define, because in one sense we have the new and the cutting edge and the next thing. And on the other end, we have, people who still think that this microphone is amazing and the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Right, right. Yeah, well, and it's interesting too, thinking of the church context of, do you know your congregation well enough to know what technology they can quote unquote handle, or what enhances their worship? Because if you're doing a service for young adults, you want more lights, you want more almost higher end production, versus if it's a bunch of older folks in a room, you probably want things more stripped back. You might even want more house lights on, like stuff, like little details like that are different depending on who your congregation is. And if you have a mixture too, how would you even go about that? If it truly is a full multi-generational church, how would you approach technology in that situation?
Yeah. Oh man, that is such a difficult question. And I don't want to punt on this, but I feel like that really needs to start with the heart of the congregation. Because at the end of the day, like the church is everyone in the church. It's not the worship team. It's not the pastor. It is everyone there.
Absolutely.
And so like the older generation needs to understand that, like, hey, with attention spans where they are, like all the flashing lights actually help some people focus.
Totally.
And the younger generation needs to understand that, like, we have an older generation, and honestly, their eyes may not work as great, so they need those house lights to help them, read
or like the sound
Bibles.
is too loud for them.
Yeah, totally. And that is both the beauty and challenge of Christianity, is to be loving and inclusive. Like we are all made in God's image. We
Absolutely.
are all some facet of God's image, and to put self aside in order to specifically cater to the needs of everyone else in your congregation, like that's a huge sacrifice to make, and that's a huge sacrifice to ask an entire congregation to make from time to time to time, as they grow in their understanding and love of one another.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And just going even back of knowing the congregation too, of slowly introducing certain things, or even maybe explaining, like why we do what we do. Because I think that sometimes the church even misses the like why, like because you can so easily enter in through the doors of a church and be like, there's just so much production going on here. And if you're not familiar with that, it's foreign, it feels like it's distracting. But if that's what you were raised in and grew up with, you're like, no, it enhances my worship. And it's so interesting how people's experiences as well determine what level of technology production they can handle. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and that gets into like understanding intentions, and we're just so far off of the technology circuit, but that's so important, is to understand the intentions of people around you and their choices. Right, like again, like walking into a church whose tradition that you didn't grow up in. Totally. You're going to make all kinds of assumptions about what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Totally.
And so to start from that place of curiosity before criticism.
That's
so important.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah. Well, and over summer I got the opportunity to have an internship at my church, and a part of it was not just doing because music is more my focus and avenue of worship that I really like to live in. But I got the opportunity to learn a lot more about the production side, a lot more about the lighting, the video, and everything. And I was absolutely in awe of one of my friends who is in charge of running the lighting and the cameras. And that day he was in more of the production role of like when cameras switch to what camera. And he spends hours just editing all the lights of like doing the lights to certain hits and kicks on the drums because he's a drummer too, and how you can totally just mesh those different aspects of worship of, okay, lighting's an aspect, but then so is drums, and how do I blend the two to enhance the full picture? And it's just, it blew me away watching the attention to detail and the time that he put in to program all the lights, but then he already has it programmed, but then in service to even the certain switches of the camera with the hits and just all those different things and how those mesh and are blended and how that just enhance the worship even more. And seeing, especially if you're viewing from online, like that is what you're seeing. You're seeing that view. And yes, it's on like the TVs on the side. And so if you can't see the stage or something, then you can see it from the screens on the side too. And just how cool it is that, yes, worship is not just limited to singing praises and to music, but it is this whole other thing, and that can enhance it together of lighting and drums and production, and all of that can enhance it and blend with music too to create this full-blown experience, if you want to call it that, yet just time of communal worship, and how cool it is that how even people's different gifts are used to enhance all of that. I think that's beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When do you think using technology goes too far?
So I think we touched on this a little bit just in terms of the glass, but yeah, anytime that it is used to draw attention to itself rather than serve as a catalyst to draw attention to God. I think, we may all have heard about the famous zip lining incident recently. There was I forget where it was, but there was a church that just zip lined their pastor onto stage for the sermon. And, I'll start with curiosity before criticism, but I'm having a hard time theologically justifying a zip line.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And that sounds so ridiculous, but at the same time, like, that started somewhere. Like, no one was just like, hey, let's have a zip line next week. Like, there had to be some creeping escalation of like, hey, let's do this thing, and then let's do this thing, and then let's do this thing, and let's do this thing. And that first thing might actually have been very well-intentioned, right? That first thing might have been, hey, let's add some moving lights so that we add flexibility and can better enhance the mood of the sermon or whatever's going on. But, likely what happened is there were just checks that weren't being done. Like, we weren't continually asking the question, is this pointing to God?
Yeah.
Is this serving the function? And then, a year later we have a zip line on stage.
Right.
So yeah, it's I mean, this kind of gets to a different question of how do we prevent that from happening? And it's that continual accountability. It's approaching technology with a theological standpoint and not just a technological one. Right. And not that your senior pastor should necessarily be dictating what technology you use, but there should be levels of accountability in spending and in technology and in all of that design where we are asking that question of how is this glorifying God? That's APU's motto is God first.
Yes.
And I think that's a little bit of a misnomer because I think that the danger in that is we put God first on the checklist and then we do everything else, as opposed to putting God first at the beginning of everything on the checklist, right?
Yes.
Are we approaching God first?
Should be within the whole process.
Exactly. Are we approaching God first in our theology? Are we approaching God first in, the chairs we're purchasing for our congregation? Are we putting God first in the technology and budget and design that we're doing? And so I think that is just really important to, again, keep God first at the center of all of it. Right.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. And I think that the question of what's too far totally goes into, are we discussing as like, do you have a board of elders? And then does your senior pastor go to the board of elders? And as a congregation, are we actually talking to one another? Like, is it just the leadership team or are we talking to the members? And is that conversation flowing? And are we asking the question of, is this glorifying God? versus ourselves versus the technology itself, and those questions too. As we come to a close, if you were to give anyone who's listening a piece of advice on whether it's how to approach technology in worship or from your own life with technology in worship and just with what we discussed today, what would you leave them with?
I think I'll maybe zoom out on that just a little, in terms of just understanding what's really at the core of who you are as a person. You are not your job. You are not your skills. You are not your talents. You are not your giftings. You are an amazing combination of so many things. And to limit yourself and define yourself by a singular thing, whether that is music or a hobby or a career or whatever it is just honestly just it's denying so many other facets
of who God created you to be.
Exactly. So I guess my advice is just don't get locked in so hard to one thing. Like, leave room and space in your life for God to show you new aspects of himself in you. Find those core things that are so special and meaningful to you, no matter what specific personal or professional scenario you're in.
Yeah, that's beautiful and a great thing for people to walk away with. Thank you so much, J-Lord, for your time, for your wisdom, and for your just knowledge in technology and how that enhances worship. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for watching our podcast. We hope you enjoyed our first episode of our series, Avenues of Worship Through the Arts. This episode was with Jonathan Lord about technology as worship. And if you are interested in audio, video, and lighting, feel free to look at the description below about Worship Arts Lab. We have a camp this summer where that will be one of our tracks and workshops with Jonathan Lord personally. And so if you liked this conversation, press the like button and subscribe to our channel for more. Hope to see you soon.